Welcome everyone to Raid Recap Runny Nose Edition. What we are looking at today is, much like we did yesterday for Mythic Plus, is the recap of what's been going on this week in the raid in terms of changes, because much like we have been able to notice yesterday when it comes to Mythic Plus, the balance tuning brought by Blizzard almost 10 days ago at this point might have changed the power level of some specs in the raid. And spoiler alert, it looks like it did, or at the very least we are in the process of seeing some changes to the power of some specs in the raid, not even that similar to what we saw in Mythic Plus, where, for example, we pointed out Fire Mage now being suddenly much stronger, and also Assassination Rogue perhaps losing a lot more in terms of popularity in Mythic Plus this week. For the raid, we have some different entries for this week. Now, what you're seeing in front of you is the before. This is before Blizzard launched the changes, the balance tuning of a couple of resets ago. So right with this snapshot of the raid, we still didn't get the buffs to all of the mages. We had no buffs to Devastation, no buffs to Windwalker, no nerfs to Havoc, no nerfs to Assassination, no buffs to Destruction and Affliction Warlocks. All of that was missing. Now, we fast forward about 10 days, now we have gotten enough new logs, enough new entries in the raid to see the effect of these changes, and this is what we have this week, right now, right today. Now, clearly the first thing that jumps to the eye is an odd Devastation Evoker suddenly being second. They previously were bottom half of the performance, and now out of nowhere they are second. What also jumps to the eye is Affliction. Affliction being another one of the specs being buffed, jumping up almost 10 positions compared to last week in terms of performance. We also do see the effects on all three of the mage specs, which were all buffed, and now they all jumped up a few positions all together, all three of them. Same goes, although perhaps not nearly as exciting, was the rise of Windwalker, which definitely went up in performance, although still hanging out more or less in the middle of the results in the raid. Similarly, for the other spec buffed by a measly 3%, it's Red Paladin, which used to be third last before the changes. Now it is 6th last in terms of performance, so baby steps, improvements for Red Paladin as well. This is also visible in other types of, like for example, a tier list based on the throughput, on the performance of the specs. You can see clearly the improvement of Devastation, also the improvement of Affliction Warlock. Same goes for, well, the other mage specs, now all doing much better than before. Not too visible were the two nerfs to Assassination and to Havoc, which are still doing plenty fine. Of course, once you factor in the popularity of the specs, so not just their performance by a few of them, for example Devastation, while showing up here, they are still not exactly a popular spec. For example, same concept as usual for marksmanship, right? So when you factor in the popularity, of course, you still have certain specs which show up doing very well, like Devastation, but also like Fire Mage, and now also like Affliction, not really showing up nearly as much when it comes to the popularity. The same is displayed in another tier list from u.gg, where you see Affliction doing 207,000 average, and yet someone who is doing 195 like BM, or 200 like Havoc, or 187 like Ret are showing up in the S tier. And that's mostly because of their current popularity. Here is BM, here is Havoc, and here is Ret, compared to something like Affliction, which is literally dead last in terms of presence in the raid, at the very least for now. Maybe given their performance it will be bound to rise in popularity, but for now it's not doing nearly as well. Talking about the buffs of specs like Devastation. Is Devastation a fraud? Is it like we pointed out in the last couple of weeks, specs like Elemental or specs like Balance or specs like Marksmanship rising a lot in the overall meters because they were overperforming in a couple of fights, like for example these two specs on Council? Or is it actually because they are doing well on most fights? If we go to the actual difficult ones, like for example Ferak, on Ferak, do you see Devastation doing well? Well, the answer is no, because there are no Devastation players actually playing Ferak. What about Tindral? On Tindral, Devastation is showing up to be doing extremely well together with Demo. However, much like we mentioned before, Devastation is a grand total of 5 parses on Tindral. Their rise in the overall performance is also affected by just 5 players playing Devastation on Tindral. What about Smolderon, a pure single target fight with good mobility? Here is Devastation still in their bottom half position. What about Nimue? Maybe with some burst damage on the adds, Devastation evokers can do well. Not really, still bottom half. What about Larodar? Some burst AoE damage when the trees spawn. Devastation is bottom half. What about Council? Spread, cleave, fight. Devastation is bang, middle. Let's go back down to Volcaros. Devastation is again bottom half on pure single target. Igira, Devastation is slightly above half. And then the meme fight of Nullroot Devastation is also slightly above half. So TLDR, this is a fraud. Yes, Devastation was buffed, but nowhere nearly, especially since the buff was primarily for AoE damage, for pyre damage, so this result in the overall meters is quite misleading. It's not that Devastation has jumped up in this performance across all fights. The majority of the single target focused fights still see Devastation as being quite poor overall. There are a few other specs that have improved their performance, in particular Arcane Mage and Affliction Warlock. If we do the same thing and we go back to something like Ferak, number one, same concept, there are no Affliction Warlocks doing Ferak, as well as when it comes to Arcane Mages, they aren't even doing that well on Ferak. When it comes to Tindral, that's where Affliction starts to get a higher rating, and once more, Affliction is a grand total of 2 logs. So with just a couple of logs, Affliction is supposedly doing very well on those 2 players, so it makes them show on average much higher than they would be because of this good couple of logs on Tindral. If you go back to the average fights with way more logs, like this one, like Smolderon, Affliction is closer towards the bottom. Back onto Nimue, Affliction is below the half. You go back to Larodar, Affliction is again bang middle, and this will repeat. So yes, it does show up here, suddenly doing much better after the buffs, just like Devastation, but the results are not nearly as exciting as you would think just by looking at this. Once you start looking at each individual boss, these results are not nearly as impressive. This looks like it's a very overperforming result for Affliction, and then you switch this to a proper, single target straight up boss, and Affliction's numbers go back down on average with much weaker results compared to, for example, the top performers. So yes, these specs have been buffed, but no, don't get excessively baited by looking at the all results on all bosses, because they will take into account even just a couple of logs, few logs on some particular unique bosses where these specs are overperforming. In this case, Affliction, Devastation, we could probably say the same, like we said already in the last couple of weeks for specs like Marksmanship that were overperforming, or specs like Elemental, or specs like Balanced Druid. In terms of surprises, yes, they do look like, at first glance, like great results, but once you look a little bit deeper in the performance of the specs, the improvements are not that major for these specs we mentioned, at least. The one that is more comprehensive is, of course, Windwalker, because it was also buffed by more than these other specs. Of course, it's hard to be that excited considering that even with their improvements, they are still just barely in the middle of results. So once more, once you move to fights like Tindral, Windwalker is still in the bang middle, even if you consider there were only 7 Windwalker monks being logged on this boss. When it comes to Smolderon, pure single target, after the buffs, Windwalker is still doing quite poorly. Where you do see the rise is because of Nimue. Here is your number 1 DPS on Nimue, for now being Windwalker. And this is more representative because we're not talking about 2 logs, we're not talking about 7 logs for Windwalker, we are talking about 550, so it's a bit more stable in terms of the representation of players playing Windwalker on this fight. Again, middle of the pack when it comes to Larodar, again, middle of the pack when it comes to Council, single target boss like Volcaros, middle of the pack once more, Igira, middle of the pack. So this is more consistent with the current result of Windwalker, roughly middle of the pack, with one very well-performing fight being Nimue, where they are first. Now, it is still worth reminding everyone that despite these results, many many of these changes might take some more time because they are still very heavily impacted by the play rate, by the population playing these specs. As we go once more to the popularity of each and every spec, even if Affliction is getting buffed, it's hard to see much growth in Affliction if Demonology has 30 times more players. Where are gonna be 95% of the best Warlock players? They're all gonna be playing Demo. As long as some of these top quality players don't go back down to play Affliction and start pulling good logs for Affliction, you won't see the full potential of the spec. Because to reach the full potential of the spec, you also need to have the best players playing that spec. So as long as they remain this unpopular, it's going to continue to be quite hard to get great results on the spec. Same can be said for something like Devastation. As long as Augmentation has 5 times the players, it's also 5 times more likely that the better players of the spec will have gone to play Augmentation, or perhaps will have gone to play a completely different spec other than Devastation. So that's also a problem when you buff very weak, very underplayed specs. The fact that it still takes time for them to switch to the spec, to re-roll to the spec, for example. It is arguably definitely easier for pure DPS classes like Warlocks and Mages, because they have 3 different options in the same class. So it's much easier. It's much easier for the demo players to simply respec Affliction and between 1 week and the next start playing way more. As opposed to the ones who are risking it all. The ones who are playing Havoc, the ones who are playing Ret, the ones who are playing Balance, Enhancement, Feral, Windwalker, Shadow Priest. These type of players don't have nearly as much room to simply reroll to another option in their class that easily. Even in the case of Balance, they would have to go and play Melee, or something like Enhancement playing Elemental, which is much harder, of course. You need to have Agility trinkets, Agility weapons. If you want to respec from Elemental to Enhancement, for example, you have to move from Melee to Ranged, or from Ranged to Melee, which might take even more time, and it might not even be available in your raid roster, because you might not need more of one of the types of DPS. So it's much easier to see, for example, from 1 week to the next, suddenly a whole bunch of Fire players ditching Fire to go and play Frost if Frost is doing better than some of these other specs right here. Now, we didn't just have some changes to the DPS, we also had some changes to the healers. Primarily, we had some slight nerfs to Mistweaver and also buffs to Holy Priest. Now, finally, after what has been quite a long while, Holy Priest is supposedly no longer the one at the bottom of the HPS. Finally, they passed, just barely, past Restoration Druid. They're still, a good 15% behind Mistweaver Monk as the top dog in terms of HPS, but it is at least a start to not be completely dead last. Now, when it comes to the popularity though, of course they still suffer from the overt popularity of Discipline, but as you know, Holy is still a wildly popular spec. You know, if we move just for a second from Mythic to Heroic, you get to see just how easily Holy Priest can crush Discipline, even in a meta where Discipline is supposedly stronger. Even just a slight buff, even just a tiny little nudge towards being stronger for Holy gets them to immediately become much closer to Discipline. What is also true is that the deeper we go into the tier, not just this tier but any tier, the deeper you go, the less damage you're going to be taking, the more the bosses are going to be nerfed, the more item level you will get, the more stamina you will get, the less needed will be bursts of healing like the ones of a Discipline Priest, and the stronger will be the continuous healing, the continuous throughput and HPS, which is why over time very often the Discipline Priest popularity goes further and further down, and other specs like Holy Priest keep rising more and more because of how more easy and straightforward healing becomes. Looks like we're getting here early in this tier after the couple of back-to-back buffs to Holy Priest and also the couple of back-to-back nerfs to Discipline Priest. So we are getting closer in terms of the gaps in the play rate of the specs. The performance still has a few outliers, still mostly around Mistweaver Monk. Even after the nerfs, their their advantage over the other specs is still quite there. But at the very least, now it is nice to see that the weaker spec has now been buffed a little bit more. And now you could be saying, yeah, but now if you buff the weaker spec, now a different spec will now become the weaker spec, and now they will be in need of a buff. Well, if you want to see the glass half full, you know, if you want to see the other side of the coin, when you jump into Mythic Plus, right now Restoration Druid is amongst the 3 meta spec and very popular. So, you know, the Holy Priest being the weaker in the raid, while they are also the weaker in Mythic Plus, kind of feels unfair. Meanwhile, if you split the roles a little bit, if you turn Resto Druid into the weaker in the raid, while simultaneously being a meta pick in Mythic Plus, that feels a little bit more fair. You have one category, one type of activity where you're very good, and another one where you are kind of mediocre. It feels more fair to put Resto Druid in this state compared to Holy Priest, which hasn't really been powerful in anything this season. That's the state right now for healers after the changes. More visible the buffs to Holy Priest than the nerfs to Mistweaver were, as well as the DPS, which we have pointed out being harder to notice, especially when you look at things like tier list and things like overall rankings, because they take into account all the bosses, they make the average, and you might be misled by certain specs overperforming on one particular boss and spiking up their average damage. So you get to think that right now Devastation is the super meta pick for DPS in the raid, when it really isn't. It really is just still quite the average spec, and still likely not taken over the likes of something like Augmentation for the time being. What we have seen perhaps being the more respectably honest rises in power in the raid are the mages, in particular Arcane and Windwalker. Yes, Windwalker doesn't look that exciting because they were terrible and now they are just mediocre, so it's still not very exciting, but the improvement is visible, as well as the mage specs. The Red Paladin improvement also was very small, even though visible it was quite minor. We haven't really seen any major improvements to the buffs of Elemental, also because the buff was mostly just to their Earthquake, to their AoE, so it won't have a huge effect in the raid. Same goes for the 3% damage nerf to Assassination. Assassination was second best, now they fell down a little bit more. They still remain amongst the top of performance together while being still very popular. Their damage is still plenty fine overall, even after this 3% nerf as a spec in the raid. So they're not really in shambles right now, even after this nerf, which was warranted and needed, much like not changing whatsoever when it comes to Havoc. The nerf to Havoc, we have checked it out in Mythic Plus, it hasn't really affected them whatsoever. Same goes for the raid, where they are still amongst the top 4, top 5 performers at the moment. Finishing off with the changes to the Warlocks, we saw a more consistent change with Destruction, which means nothing. They haven't really changed. If anything, actually they dropped in performance compared to last week, whereas Affliction out of nowhere spiked up in the top 6 of performance thanks to basically a couple of logs on a single boss, whereas the remainder of their other boss fights are still quite mediocre, even after the buffs. So it seems like we had to make another one of these videos where we warn the unassuming players not to just blindly trust these type of overall meters into just believing what you see at first glance, because quite a few of these can be misleading and not really tell the full truth in terms of the performance of the DPS specs. So that's the recap of today's week in the raid after the balance tuning, while also clarifying why these changes in performance to some of the DPS specs have happened and just how genuine they are, whether or not they are flukes or actual consistent increases in their performance. So for today, as we start approaching the weekend, it's time to leave each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. Like, for example, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you, of course, guys, for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this runny nose video was a pain. This annoying, sneaky cold out of nowhere.